4, 3. This is Hart Hagen with Let's Talk, and we have a special guest today, Justin Nobel from Rolling Stone magazine. I'll give him a more complete introduction in just a minute, but first, we're taking questions from our audience, and Mr. Parker from Bullitt County was talking about what are the hazards to school-age children. Virginia Bush was asking about the brine being dumped on the roads. Justin has a special area of expertise in the radioactivity presented by oil and gas, and we're taking questions from people like, what questions do you bring to this conversation? I have a few questions, if I just find them.
Yeah, Art, this is Mr. Parker. Can I ask a question?
Please do.
What is the gentleman's experience with the state success rates with the regulatory agencies that are supposed to govern and provide the safe keeping of its residents and taxpayers? Has he found in his research and his dissertations a tendency for state agencies very similar to what we're finding now here in Kentucky, that really are just rubber stamp agencies? They really do not provide for the taxpayers or the utility users, really do not provide us any protection whatsoever. They, more than anything else, they facilitate the activities of utility companies, and basically allow them to abuse their rights and take away those that we thought we had as landowners in the Commonwealth here in Kentucky. I mean, we've gone against the Public Service Commission.
Let's go on to another question, Colonel Parker. Thank you for the question.
Well, and I'm just saying those are, I just noted, Hart, the first 3 questions. Those are all great questions. I can start from there.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Why don't you go ahead and start?
You can, okay, yeah, so I'm just going to go in order that those were asked.
Let me give you a good introduction for our listening audience. Justin Noble writes on issues of science and the environment for Rolling Stone, Audubon, Oxford American, D-Smog, and other U.S. magazines. His work has been published in Best American Travel Writing, 2011 and 2016, and Best American Science and Nature Writing. A book he co-wrote with a death row exoneree, The Story of Dan Bright, was published in 2016 by University of New Orleans Press. He is presently working on a book about the issue of radioactivity brought to the surface in oil and gas production and the many different pathways of contamination posed to the industry's workers and the public, to be published by Simon & Schuster and tentatively titled Petroleum 238, Big Oil's Dangerous Secret and the Grassroots Fight to Stop It. So, Justin, I was impressed when I read your article with what a big story this is, and it's kind of hidden in plain sight. Regulators have known about this for a long time, and yet it's not common knowledge, and the EPA is not doing its job. So go ahead and take it from the beginning. Pretend that we know nothing. What do you want to share with us today?
Okay, well first, thank you, Hart, for reaching out and organizing this, and thank you everyone absolutely for dialing in. It's really an essential part of the investigative journalism process is people in communities who are fighting big projects, who are paying attention with their eyes and ears. There's a lot of research, a lot of scientific research, a lot of talking to scientists that's involved with my work. But I would not be able to gather and understand so much were it not for people just like you all who are recording and observing. And I know how traumatic that is. And even talking earlier this evening to Miss Brown, Kimberly Brown, and learning about some of the things you all have been going through. I mean, you face a lot to gather and record stories, information, whether it's on a phone, with a document, with your body. You know, that is something that I really take seriously and pay attention to as an investigative journalist, and also try and encourage other journalists to not discount people as, quote, an activist or an environmentalist. These are the people who are the front lines of.
Will you mute me?
So these are the people who are the front lines of the investigative journalism ecosystem, and really you all, speaking out of journalists, have to pay attention to you all, who are facing problems and gathering information. And yeah, I can go through the 3 questions asked right off the bat were just really good questions. So maybe I'm one, like, if I don't get it out, I'll forget it. So maybe I'll answer those and then go into a bigger picture story of oil and gas radioactivity. So first question that was asked was about pipelines running by schools. I think this is such an important issue to focus on, and it connects with the gentleman's next question, which was about, how do the regulators do this? They've sold us out. They're working for the utility companies, not us. And I think if you look at pipelines and where they run, and running close to senior centers and hospitals and schools, this question's really brought into light, right? I mean, how had these projects, which have these huge risks, been enabled to happen so close to these sort of facilities, and typically without a really appropriate plan in place? And I'll just say that it's a good question you have. I can't really answer it per se. It's not appropriate, of course, for a pipeline to be close to an elementary school, for example. But what I will say is that there's groups, I don't know if y'all are in touch with groups in Southeast Pennsylvania who are fighting the Mariner East pipeline, but I can certainly give you a really great contact. There's a couple really great people who are fighting that pipeline, and they have developed essentially a toolkit. I mean, they've been at this, like you all, I think, for a long time, and have been really effective at raising awareness about this issue in particular. And it's not like the pipeline's still going forward, but they've held it up in various ways and really tripped it up quite a bit. And one of the tactics they've used has to focus on that, to focus on how many facilities like schools and other other community-oriented places like that are close to the pipeline. So that, I think they probably, or another group that has already maybe focused on this, might have some helpful tips on how to raise better awareness on that, because it's an issue that exists in other pipeline fights as well, and especially that the Mariner East pipeline in Pennsylvania.
Justin, I think what a lot of people don't know is just the existence of radioactivity. I know in your article you said that the Marcellus Shale formation is something that is over Ohio and West Virginia, Pennsylvania, and not all sources of oil and gas are equally radioactive. Some are more than others. And the Marcellus formation, which is a cause of a lot of this fracking in West Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Ohio, upriver from us, is particularly radioactive. So, and we're talking uranium. It's like, one thing you said in your article is that people who have to handle these radioactive materials, like brine and wastewater, fracking wastewater, they're not trained to deal with radioactive materials, but yet they're having to deal with them. So that was surprising to me.
Okay, yeah, so let's get right into that topic then, which I think will also take us to answer the second question about oil field brine in Kentucky. So I think you've got to, before you go at this topic, take a step back and just think about oil and gas development. And unless you come from an area where there's a lot of oil and gas development, one might not be aware that a lot more than just oil and gas comes to the surface when you drill for oil or gas. You have all sorts of different waste products that come up as well. And one of the most abundant waste products is this really salty, toxic liquid that the industry has innocently called brine or produced water. it comes up in huge amounts with oil and gas. Often, many wells will produce, most wells produce much more brine than they do oil or gas, and some wells can produce 10 times as much brine as they do oil. So that's a huge amount of material to deal with. And if you just think, oh, it's brine, it's salt water, it maybe isn't so difficult to deal with it. But brine actually has volatile organics. So these are known human carcinogens like benzene. It has toxic heavy metals, things like arsenic and lead, and it has the radioactive element radium. And the levels of radium can be quite high in brine. So even before we get to some of the other worrisome things that come to the surface, we have this brine to deal with. And there's a really great image that a nuclear forensic scientist that I was in touch with laid out to me, which is really helpful for me in just framing what's happening here. And he describes that essentially with oil and gas development, we have created a transit system for bringing radioactivity up to the surface. And that's really what we've done. There are, and I'll get into exactly why different elements are down there and in what levels, but we have created with oil and gas a series of tunnels, right? You know, down to these different oil and gas formations, and we bring this stuff up to the surface. And sure, we think a lot about the oil and gas, but we don't often think about the other things get brought up. And radioactive material is part of that. So that's just a way of kind of like tweaking how you look at an oil and gas well. Sure, it's a way to create energy, and it's also a way to bring radioactivity to the surface. That's what's happening.
Another thing, sorry to interrupt, but another thing that you said was they knew for a long time, scientists have known for a long time that the Marcellus Formation had uranium in it. Right. It's just only until recently was it feasible through fracking, through the technology of fracking, it was feasible to bring that oil to the surface. But the radioactivity has always been there. They've always known about it. And the EPA says, oh, we can't regulate that. It would drive them out of business.
Right. So what's concerning with fracking is, so we've always had brine. Go back to the first oil and gas well, Titusville, Pennsylvania. There would have been brine, and that brine probably would have had a concerning amount of radium. But what's new with fracking is you're actually drilling down vertically, right? But then you're drilling horizontally, and typically you're drilling horizontally through a black shale layer. And the Marcellus, the layer you just mentioned, the layer that underlies a lot of Ohio, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, the Marcellus is a black shale with a well-known radioactive signature. And in fact, all black shales have some level of radioactivity. And that's because your black shale is like the mother lode for oil and gas. So if you imagine a shallow marine environment, like maybe the upper part of the Gulf of Mexico right now, you have a lot of dead organic material, maybe dead algae, things like that, small organic things. There's a lot of it, and it's falling to the bottom of the sea, and it's accumulating at the bottom of the sea. And that dead organic material, that literally will form your future oil and gas. And that over time will form a black shale layer. But also at the bottom of that shallow sea, you have uranium-238 and thorium-232, these two very long-lived radioactive elements accumulating as well. So this story goes back to the beginning, and it's appropriate to say, you know, the radioactivity literally has been cooked in to the oil and gas layer from the actual formation of the layer. And so, yeah, as you point out, Hart, the USGS started to become aware of this during the United States' nuclear era. And in the 1960s, they actually looked in black shales to see if there was enough uranium to mine for nuclear weapons production and energy production. So that's a pretty wild revelation. Before we even were looking at the Marcellus for fracking it, we were looking at it for uranium. So we know it's there, and it's connected to the geology. And not just that, when they went to frack the Marcellus, there's a direct relationship, and the USGS talks about this, between where you have high organic content, which is where that's going to be your best hydrocarbon potential, and uranium. So the sweetest spots of the Marcellus tend to be the most radioactive, and that's often how they found the sweetest spots.
So how does this radioactivity end up being exposed? How do people end up being exposed to it? And in what instances are workers and so forth, ill prepared for this? I remember you told a story about somebody who cleaned a pipe and the pipe drained into the garden, and later his pregnant wife was sitting on the edge of the bathtub. Her hip broke because the radioactivity had impacted her bones.
Yeah, right. Really shocking story. So when oil or gas is coming up in the wellhead piping, the vertical piping, there's going to be brine. There's going to be this salty water as well. This whole mix is coming up together, and the brine has a lot of radium. Unlike many of the radioactive elements down in the Earth's lead, radium has a tendency to flow water. It's moderately soluble. So brine and the salty nature of brine actually helps kick the radium out of formation. It brings it up. And so you have radium coming up in the piping system. But just like in your kitchen sink, when you have a change in pressure or a filter or a valve, gunk accumulates and you get these mineral scale deposits. The same thing happens in oil field piping. And so you get a scale, a mineral scale that forms. But in this case, the scale has very high levels of radium. Over time, you bring a lot of product up, you accumulate radium, it accumulates, and that oil field piping can get very thick scales, and the levels of radium are extraordinary, and that has to be cleaned out eventually. And so this is one of the
somebody has to clean it out. So that crap accumulates, and then somebody has to clean up the crap, and it's your husband or your son or somebody has to clean that up, and they don't have the protective gear that you would have if you worked in a nuclear plant.
Absolutely right. And so you're right on there. And this is one of the first warning calls that the industry had a radioactivity problem, is because, again, we're well before fracking now. We're in the conventional oil and gas days. And the story you're referring to happened in Mississippi. And this was really a backyard operation. So you've got these big major oil and gas players. They're getting all this oil and gas out of the ground, but their pipes are becoming coated with this scale. So they send it to these kind of backyard operators who had a good business going. They would help these big companies clean this gunk out of the pipes. Well, the big companies like Chevron and Shell never told them that the gunk had very high levels of radioactivity. And so these workers are working. It was in Mississippi. They're in a backyard, essentially, literally right next to someone in the family's vegetable garden, and they're cleaning the scale out. And the scale is really, it's a mineral deposit. So to clean it, you use this complicated chisel device, which creates a huge amount of dust. So the workers, they don't know what they're dealing with. So they're not wearing appropriate PPE. They're not wearing masks. They're breathing in this dust. So they're breathing radium into their body. And then a lot of the radium-laden dust also settled out on this adjacent vegetable garden. And it's such a powerful exposure pathway that just, this woman eating some of the vegetables that were coated with radium and grown in this soil that had now been enriched by radium, she brought radium into her body. Radium is what's referred to as a bone seeker. It has a similar chemical makeup as calcium. So once inside your body is able to excrete some of it. It pushes it back out, but a good amount of radium is incorporated into your skeleton structure because your body thinks it's taking in something good, but it's not. It's taking in a radioactive element. And so have a radioactive element building up in your bones, and it's going to do what radioactive elements do, which is decay, and decay means a radioactive element will blast out a bit of radiation, literally losing small little pieces of itself, these very high energy particles. And after it's lost a piece of itself, it literally has become another element. And unfortunately for radium, you're way high up in the decay chain. So it will blast out of radiation. It will become another radioactive element and on down the line. And you have this nuclear process happening within your body.
So devil's advocate, okay, this is tragic for a few people who are exposed to it who happen to work in the industry. Devil's advocate says 99% of people never have to worry about this.
Yeah, no. So what I've been able to do with my reporting is put together so many different pieces on this and see how far it does go. So we've just described one job, and that job is referred to as pipe cleaning. And now we have another job in the Marcellus, right, with fracking. We have a brine hauler. So this is a worker who's taking the brine I was talking about, which has a high radioactive signature. And just to give you an idea of levels, the EPA has a safe drinking water limit for radium. We do not want radium in our drinking water limit. They've set the limit at 5 picocuries per liter. The EPA considers a liquid with more than 60 picocuries per liter radium as radioactive. Marcellus brine can have radium at levels that are above 20,000 and even almost up to 30,000 picocuries per liter. So that's a significant amount of radium. It's in these trucks. The driver is driving the truck often to a site called an injection well. So that's in a community right there. I mean, if you look up brine truck crash, water truck crash, saltwater truck crash, you will see that these trucks crash regularly. They have a really kind of off of gravity. They're often go around country roads. Driver might not be from the area, so they're crashing. So right there, you've brought radioactivity into your community. If a brine truck crashes on the way to an injection well and it's in your town, and the truck crashes into, which has happened quite often enough, a farmer's field, or even in Barnesville, Ohio, a brine truck crash just beside a reservoir. So the material in that truck, which has not just radium, but other really concerning heavy metals as well, is now going to go into the drinking water supply. That's just one way. The people who live near the injection well have a concern too, because the injection well is just a way to put at pressure this brine back into the earth.
So the injection well, it's like once you bring all this brine, you said that most of what they draw out of the ground is not oil and gas, but it's brine. The brine is like 10 times more than the oil and gas. Now they have to do something with it. And there are these businesses and communities that have said, hey, you can store your toxic waste with us. And then, never mind so that's why the brine is an issue. That's why as long as you're bringing it out of the ground, you have to have a place to store the brine. And you're saying that's what you mean by injection well.
Yeah, exactly. No, thanks for focusing in there. And so, right, in the early days of the industry, the brine, like in Louisiana, for example, they literally just let it go into the bayou. They just thought it was salty water. We'll put it in the bayou. Well, eventually stuff in the bayou started dying, and they also found out that radium was accumulating in oysters. So radium will accumulate in the environment. Other heavy metals will as well. So what we do now with most of the brine that comes up in oil and gas development is we send it off to an injection well. But for one, we've learned that injection wells have caused earthquakes in many parts of the country. And secondly, and I run this question, and this goes back to the gentleman's question about regulators, I have constantly asked them, how do you know? Do you have cameras down there? What science can you use to confirm to me that when you put material down an injection well, it isn't going to leak out of the intended zone where you're putting it? And they really can't answer that question. So we have this, and especially in a karst area, we have caves, we have old coal mines, we have all sorts of holes in the ground. You have plenty of pathways for material to eventually come back to the surface. And of course, we know over time, I mean, what is now a flat area will eventually, be pushed up and be a mountain range. So I don't think you can accurately say what we're putting back down is going to stay there. And so many communities where injection wells are, they're rightly concerned. And just to give you an idea, I know there's one right near the Kentucky border, actually in Southern Ohio, in the Athens area, not far from Kentucky, I guess closer to the West Virginia border, but the injection well in their community, they've staked it out and they get like 100 trucks in the 24-hour period. And there's trucks in this worrisome material, and the trucks will often stage in a public rest area across the street where, a family might be on a vacation and kids are going in to use the restroom and they're walking past trucks that are containing this really worrisome material, but they have no idea what's in them. So that leads us to, how is this all possible? But I just want to finish the worker bit. So, we're worried about these workers cleaning pipes. Well, the brine haulers, they aren't just, it turns out, driving a brine truck. They often will be responsible for cleaning their truck, which means they will crawl into the back. There's a little hole called the clamshell, and they'll have to crawl into the truck. They'll maybe have like a shovel or a squeegee to scrape the walls, and they clean this gunk that's accumulated from carrying the brine back and forth. And this is really concerning because they're now in an enclosed space, and they're cleaning the settled gunk that's come off of the brine over time. And that is absolutely where the industry calls that sludge. And that's where you're going to expect levels of radioactivity to be even higher. And these workers have received no training for that. They're not appropriately equipped. And what's really tragic is it wouldn't even be that hard to give them some basic equipment that would protect them, but often
they don't even know what they're hauling.
Or even tell them, right? And that's what I found with a lot of the drivers. Even if they start asking questions such as you're asking tonight, you know, hey, you know, boss, I've heard that maybe this is radioactive, and you know, they suddenly become a suspect employee, and they might risk losing their job if they ask too many questions like that.
Well, how are people responding to this, Justin? You've been going all over. You've been on this for like 20 months. And you're going all over talking about this. You're talking to average people, you're talking to environmentalists, you're probably talking to some public officials. How are people responding? What are they saying?
It's great to connect with groups like you all, because I think there's been really good response from people in communities who are worried about all sorts of issues that have some threads back to this topic. I think the industry quote, at least the corporate end of it, they just don't want this material to get out, right? And it's not like they even have to actively try and suppress me, or I'm worried about that. Their bigger concern is, you know, can they keep a workforce going, right? And so you go back to like what happened historically in the coal mines, like someone who has a concern and who is trying to help the workers be better protected, you know, maybe they're suddenly disposable. But how long can the industry do that? How long can they cycle through workers as people start to wake up to this before they have to deal with it? And, you know, there's a lot else happening. There's the coronavirus, there's presidential elections, there's a lot on people's minds. And I think this issue hasn't settled in such a way that the industry has really had to be held accountable for it. I mean, that's clearly what I'm trying to do. And the workers who speak to me want that to happen. But for the most part, people don't know about it, and it's not out there yet, which is why these talks are so important.
Well, what do we know? Like, you know, workers have been exposed to this for decades. What medical studies have been done and what haven't been done? And you know, what do we know about the diseases that are caused by this exposure? And is there more exposure now than there was 10 years ago or 20 years ago?
Yeah, these are great questions. Again, going back to the gentleman's question at the beginning about, you know, our own government, are they helping us or harming us? I mean, one would think that the CDC or some state health department would have started to create a way to answer these questions. But I have not seen any evidence of that. And that's really too bad, because there are so many lives connected to these answers. So how we know about this and how we know about what can happen to oil and gas workers who work jobs where they're inside tanks or cleaning pipes, as I described before, over time, how I know about that is because there was a set of legal cases in Louisiana, and that brought the issue to light. And in those cases, in the one case I have access to, 33 different oil and gas workers working a variety of different jobs. Some of them were pipe cleaners, some of them were truck drivers hauling sludge or cleaning out sludge tanks, but others were just roughnecks or roustabout, the really kind of common general wellhead job. They worked these jobs for like 10, 15, 20 years down in the Gulf Coast. And over time, they developed various cancers, lymphomas, leukemias, colon cancer, liver cancer. And because this was carried forth in a legal case, the attorneys had radiation experts analyze these workers' exposures and tabulate them up. How long did you work this job? When you were working it, how close were you to the tank, to the pipe? Did you eat lunch in the workplace environment? Even something as simple as like licking your lips and you would catch the dust on your lips, this would add to your exposure. And over time, all of that matters. And it turns out the CDC, our own government, does have a program to analyze, they have many programs actually, to analyze radioactivity exposure. And in the case of these Louisiana oil and gas workers, this program called IREP, the Interactive Radio Epidemiological Program, was used. It was designed for workers in the nuclear industry. And the program is designed to determine whether or not cancers received in the workers can be traced to their radioactivity exposure on the job. And so in these cases, it was determined overwhelmingly with percentages, in the range of 98.9%, 99.5%, that a link could be made. The radioactivity, the cancer could be connected to the radioactivity exposure received on the ground. And the job was oil and gas industry work. So I know that's a long explanation, but that is so important. For me, that was such a vital piece of reporting because it allowed me to know that the risks were real. I'm talking to workers, I'm talking to people who are worried, and now suddenly I have a pretty solid example of instances where workers over time did receive cancers. And so what's scary is this is right. This is the conventional oil and gas industry, and the levels in the Marcellus are higher. But no one has looked at the Marcellus, and that is what's shocking. And you're led to this point where you realize, like, wow, if no one asked the question, sometimes no one just asked the question, and you would think someone is looking at that, but they're not. And I'm trying to get people to look at that. And what's really tragic, I think, is you realize, oh, wow, the industry doesn't necessarily have to look at this because some of these cancers might take 10 or 15 years to develop. So by the time the workers who did the worrisome jobs in the Marcellus get their cancers, maybe the Marcellus isn't even around anymore.
Justin,
maybe the workers are living somewhere else.
What would you like?
Yeah, it's not their problem.
What would you like to see happen?
What I would want to see is a detailed examination of oil and gas workers who have worked the jobs that we know put them at high risk of radioactivity exposure, and track we also know that generally cancers that can develop from this, and try and determine, is there indeed a correlation? Are oil and gas workers developing these certain cancers? And do we see these pockets around the country near different oil and gas plays? I mean, that would really change everything. And at least workers could then be better protected going forward. So that's a pretty important
question. Great. How about if we take some questions, Justin? George had a question. Alice had a question. Let me see. Elaine Tanner had a question. If you can unmute yourself, be my guest. George, I've unmuted you. Do you want to ask your question?
Sure. To what extent is the radioactivity from the produced brine carried over into the crude oil and the ultimate products?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. So you're dealing with a decay chain, remember? So at the wellhead, we have radium. And that's the big concern because it flows with liquids and produced water is a liquid and it's going to be there in the trucks. But in natural gas and oil, the concern is actually radon. Radon is a radioactive gas and it comes up with oil and with natural gas. And it will flow particularly with the natural gas stream. But, like gasoline is really coming from some of the heavier hydrocarbons, and this is going to be separated out at a natural gas processing plant or a refinery. So what you have happening is you have radon going through the natural gas pipeline systems, and radon has a quick half-life, which means it will go through that radioactive decay pretty swiftly. And although radon is a gas, it decays into a series of different metals. And these metals are heavier, so they wind up sticking to the pipeline. And again, the places where they get stuck are where you have a pump, a valve, a filter. So in these points along a pipeline system, in a compressor station, pumps, valves, filters, those areas, those places at a refinery, you're going to have an accumulation of these radioactive metals that are the daughter products of radon. And chiefly, we're talking about lead-210, it's a radioactive isotope of lead, and polonium-210, which is a further daughter product from lead. So, you know, to answer you, is radioactivity in gasoline? You know, not necessarily, no. The reason being because it's been accumulated on all the pumps, valves, filters, and pipes between the wellhead and your car. All of the different infrastructure along the way, this stuff has settled out. And that's why it's not going to be, you know, at the gas tank. But this a refinery certainly has issues. And this is something that the industry spoke about quite a bit in the late 80s and early 90s, and now it's just not discussed. So I have little access into how concerning this issue is and what's happening with, you know, with the material that builds up in a refinery. But I do actually, I know it's a long answer, but I think it's an important story. I am in touch with a worker in Colorado who is a machinist, and that worker works cleaning out filters, pumps, and valves that they get from refineries, from petrochemical plants, from compressor stations. So again, if you have gunk accumulating in a complicated piece of equipment that is processing your product, eventually that will impede the flow of your product. You can't have that. You want to keep product flowing. So these valves and filters are regularly cleaned, and they're complicated. So often they can't be cleaned on site or in-house. So in this case, they're being sent to a company out in Colorado, literally through the US mail, and they have a really high buildup of these radon daughter products. So they're quite radioactive. And again, this worker is not told that they're handling a radioactive material. They're just told, you know, we got this pump in, you've got a day to clean it. And they're working in a windowless room, again, kind of chiseling out a dusty material that they can easily breathe in. So there are workers being harmed who by this buildup of radioactivity in refineries. So it's not, you know, it's not there for you, the gas user, but someone along the way had to deal with it. And at least based on what I've seen so far, that person who had to deal with it probably was not appropriately equipped or informed on how to deal with it.
So we have a couple of questions. One is the post office told about this? And then Christy had a question about you know, if you live near a pipeline, is there any exposure to radioactivity or other toxic, or if you're downstream from where a pipeline might leak?
Yeah, about the post office, it's a good question. I haven't been able to take my own questioning there yet, but this one worker described getting packages through USPS or sometimes FedEx that would literally be dripping. So that's pretty concerning. I mean, that's radioactive material like dripping out through the mail. Yeah, I think there's, yeah, I don't know the answers. How many packages like that are being shipped? How many end up dripping? I don't know the answers yet, but in the sloppy way the process is described, it's, you know, yet another thing on my list to look into.
Well, let's assume that in the ordinary course of business, people don't go way out of their way to do something that is not on their job description or doesn't make them more profitable.
Right.
So go ahead.
Well, remind me the second part of that question.
If you're in a pipeline, if there's a pipeline, we've got this, you know, we've got property owners from Bullitt County who are in the path of a proposed pipeline. Kentucky has a lot of karst, and it's not a question of whether pipelines leak, but when. So, but is that, you know, is that a particular concern related to radioactivity or not?
Right. Certainly, no, great question. And this is, again, an area I'm actively looking into. So one issue would, again, go back to workers. We know this scale, this radioactive film is going to be building up on the inside of the pipeline. And there's an operation called pigging, which involves cleaning that gunk out, often with these strange looking robotic devices called pigs. But the pig will go through, it will scrape the inside of the pipeline, and it will come out at a point, a pigging station, some sort of input point to the pipeline, and there will be a human worker then who takes the pig, cleans it off. And I've had workers who have done pigging operations describe this process to me. They put the pig down on like a tarp and they clean up this material, which can be highly radioactive. And then they roll the tarp up like a big burrito and throw it in the back of a truck and drive it to this injection well site in the West Texas desert. So that's a worrisome operation. And if you live near a pipeline and you're near a pigging station, certainly I would be, I think that's a place, often you might not have access to right there, but that's a place to look, you know, if this operation
does a natural gas pipeline need to be cleaned with some regularity?
Absolutely,
Do they take them apart and clean them?
Yeah, absolutely. They do need to be cleaned. And I don't have a solid answer yet on how often they need to be cleaned, but gunk, I mean, think about how much gas is flowing through at high pressure. You're moving a lot of material, and gas, you know, there's all sorts of solids, including these radioactive elements, which are dropping out because you constantly have radon turning, literally transforming into solids. So they do have to be cleaned regularly. That's a regular job. And the second, though, and perhaps even more worrisome way that you would get radioactivity out of a pipeline is if you flare it, right? So at a compressor station, even sometimes along a pipeline system, they'll set up these temporary flares. They'll do these blowdowns, which are to literally, they'll say, this is to clean out the pipeline system. Well, what are you cleaning out? And how much radon and how much daughter products of radon, so lead-210, polonium, is being released in these flares or blowdown events.
Right.
I don't know.
When you clean out something, that product, whatever your, you know, the crap goes somewhere.
Exactly.
Does it just go onto this, fall onto the ground, and the pipeline's clean, but the ground is drenched with polonium and lead.
Right. And we just, unfortunately, if you bring that question, I have found, to a regulator, they'll be, oh yeah, there is some radon, but it goes up into the air. Well,
yeah, so the radon, but then go ahead. I'm sorry.
But even there you have to stop and you think about the science and the decay chain and you say, wow, well, radon decays out in a couple of days often. So it will literally be turning into another radioactive element, which eventually becomes radioactive lead, and that will fall out of the sky.
Oh,
so,
okay. Mm-hmm.
You know, Mr. Regulator, can you tell me where the radioactive lead is falling out of the sky?
No.
They can't. And they can say, oh, but that's ridiculous. Well, no, it's not ridiculous. And if you talk to any serious scientist who knows this, they'll say, well, yeah, that's a good question. We need to look, but we just haven't looked yet.
And so the regulators are saying, don't worry, be happy.
Yeah, essentially. And you know, I know that it's an inappropriate response because they just have not, I mean, they've read virtually nothing. And at this point, I'm in touch with everyone I can who has studied this issue. And maybe they've read like one paper and seem to think it's okay. But it's, you know, even some of the industry's own papers express a lot of concern about this issue.
Let's go to some listeners' questions. Deanna says, what happens when wastewater treatment plants are put in service to treat frackwater wastes? I think you said something about that in the Rolling Stone article. And then let me ask 2 or 3 questions at once, and I'll repeat them if I need to. How hard is it for the Wallace McMullen? How hard is it for the oil industry and cleaning employees to get a Geiger counter and check radioactivity at work situations? And Virginia Bush asked, why are injection wells far from the wellheads? Are any near residential areas, et cetera?
Okay, I'm just writing those down.
Okay.
Check Geiger, why injection wells far? Okay, all great questions. So let me go back to the first one. Okay, wastewater treatment. Yeah, absolutely. So again, we've got these radioactive elements in the water, in the wastewater that the treatment plant is trying to clean, right? So either one of 2 things is happening. Either it's successfully being removed by the treatment plant, which is often very difficult. And if it's successfully being removed, you're inherently concentrating it, right? If you're gathering out of the wastewater and collecting it, you've now collected, and now you have an even bigger problem on your hand because you've concentrated the radioactive material. So my question always, if they want to claim that they have this fancy, mysterious process to clean out the radioactivity, okay, great, you just concentrated it. What are you doing what are you doing with it now? And even if they are doing that, they'll often say, oh, well, we now take it to the landfill. And then it's you know, it's the Sisyphean cycle. It goes back into the leachate, back into the treatment plant. But if they're not removing it, which is often the case, then it just goes right out in the discharge. And typically they're not checking for radium, which is the main element of concern here. So we have radium continuously being discharged back into public waterways. And that's happening in many places in Pennsylvania. And we're in the process of testing those sites. And there have been scientific studies. There's some great researchers at Penn State and Duke who have actually looked downstream of these wastewater treatment plants and found that radioactivity, particularly radium, is indeed building up. So it's a really important point, I think, to start to crack into this, because wastewater treatment plants often need all sorts of permits. And I think the public has been successful in bringing some of these folks to task. Second question about the oil industry and the Geiger counter. I mean, yeah, if the industry were doing this right, and it's interesting, you can read, there's a document I recently found that I love. It's from the International Association of Oil and Gas Producers. So this is largely a European organization, and they lay out the right way to do these jobs. And it's stunning. You know, everyone's protected and it's all so easy. And if I show that to the folks in the US who are working these jobs, they laugh. I mean, it's a cynical laugh because they're not told any of this. So there is a right way to do it, and the right way to do it just costs more, and everyone's protected, and they would have equipment. But that's not happening in many places in the US. And again, even a worker bringing in a Geiger counter, and this is just so disturbing, that's a clue to their employer that this person is starting to figure things out. And so that becomes really dangerous. I mean, being caught with a Geiger counter, if you're a brine hauler or someone cleaning out fracking tanks, is something that could put your job in jeopardy. There are some specialized divisions where, in some of the older oil fields especially, where they have cleanup workers who actually are trained in cleaning out radioactive material and have at least a better knowledge than most.
We're going to get to the next question in just a minute, but you were talking about, on one video I listened to, about how within the industry, there's a lot of pressure to not unionize and to not complain, and you're tough, you're supposed to be tough and just suck it up and do the job and not complain about things like safety.
Yeah. I mean, that's, you know, other things come into play here, right? Economics, human psychology. I mean, there are, like a lot of the brine haulers that I've talked to, they took this job like 2012, 2014, not so long after the recession. There wasn't much work in the area where they were working, and they often work in areas where manufacturing used to be big, so that's down. And suddenly this new job comes in, and they needed a job, and they talk to people doing it, and they're like, this is great. I drive a truck, I sit in a truck all day, and I'm home at night, which is rare. A lot of truckers aren't. So sign me up. And they just weren't told about the risks. So there's an incentive to, you know, keep people in the dark. Absolutely. And that's of course why they hate unions, because unions, you know, when they're working right, are all about bringing light on a situation that's hurting the workers. So the oil and gas industry has been, they've won the fight against unions. I mean, you will not find a union at the wellhead, at least amongst most workers. You will not find a union amongst the brine haulers, the people who end up cleaning out tanks and doing some of the most concerning jobs. They don't have representatives, and that's just the way, of course, the industry likes it. And unfortunate also is OSHA has enabled this. You know, there are tools of the government, places where the government could have stepped in and helped these workers out. And to a large extent, that just hasn't happened. So do you want me to, because I had the two other questions down. It was a really good question about injection wells. So for one, many oil and gas fields have specific regulations or laws against having an injection well near where you have oil and gas development, near where you have a producing well. And that's because they don't want to, various things happen, but you can pollute the oil and gas well by injecting the junk so close to it. And you can also affect the pressure needed to bring up oil and gas by putting another well in. So they want to keep that separate in most cases. And there's specific formations that are regarded as good for holding waste. And in Pennsylvania, the geology just isn't thought to be right. It's better in Ohio. So Ohio has something like 250 oil and gas waste injection wells. Pennsylvania has maybe 10. And this is why you end up having trucks that have to go very far away from the oil field. And they do put them, though, they're pretty smart. You know, trucking is expensive. So often an injection well will be sited really close to a major intersection. But I have seen injection wells. I've stood with a woman in Eastern Ohio who could drink her coffee in the morning and look out and see the workers at the injection well. I mean, it's right beyond her backyard. So they're sited very close to homes, but she's also kind of close to a major highway. That's typically where they're going to be. But it's different in each oil and gas field. In North Dakota, for example, where you often have a much more uniform geology, there they do have injection wells located pretty close to the actual oil and gas wells, often like 3 miles away. And while they have trucks there, a lot of times they often bring the brine or produced water via pipe. But that can be an even bigger problem because a pipe can leak for many days without you even realizing it. And 96% of North Dakota is farmland. So if a pipe leaks, it's probably leaking into crops. And that's still problematic. But it's a good question about location of injection well. And I just wanted to answer the question from the way beginning about brine. So I just brought up the study that looks at oil field brine and has that 13 state statistic. And Kentucky, it seems, is not one of the 13 states. So I'm just going to search this again and make sure I'm giving you accurate information. And it developed as a way for the industry to get rid of this waste product, right? And often for a community, snow and ice removal can be a really expensive cost. It's one of the highest costs for a small municipality. So here comes the industry saying, hey, we've got salty stuff. We'll give it to you for free. And now you saved a whole lot of money. And that's how the relationship developed. But of course, now we're saying, well, let's look at what you actually are putting down on the road. And by the way, let's also look at the science. For example, for dust suppression, there's been plenty of work done to show that oil field brine actually makes roads dustier. It's really ridiculous to think that somehow magically this stuff is just going to keep dust down. It's not.
While you're looking at that, while you're looking for that answer, I'd like to kind of throw out a set of issues that Christy Collins and I have been talking about. She's a Bullitt County resident and is a caver and building inspector, so it has knowledge and concern about radon. So, you know, so they're, and in Bullitt County, they've drilled these 10 to 12 300-foot holes for reasons that we don't know why, but a result of one of the drilling was that on Vanessa Allen's farm, there was, you know, it spewed oil and, I mean, it spewed gas and water for a few days. And so it just seems to me that like they're drilling possibly for storage. The drilling itself is going to puncture caves. It's going to disrupt water supply. It's going to release radon into the atmosphere. And so am I on Christy, do you want to add anything to that? Like maybe your concerns or the scenarios we're talking about?
I really feel like Vanessa or Kim or maybe Richard could answer that. But I mean, my concern is that there's radon. They hit sweet methane, and now they're going to put this chemical in there, which is some processed methane, that whatever they're going to use for the natural gas. What is that new chemical component with natural allowable emissions? Because there's a certain amount of leaks that they're allowed to have, supposedly. And then they have not done anything with the watersheds, the water testing, and there's water running in these wells.
Yeah, no, these seem like great questions. And I was speaking just before this call with Kimberly about this, and I'm still trying to understand what they're doing. So it doesn't seem like they're mining the gas. It seems like they want to store. It's right. They're doing these tests. And yeah, I mean, that's mind-boggling because, right, there's so many permits you'd think they would need to carry out something like this. But it won't be the first time, you know, folks tried to do something without permits, but they're the regulators, right? Or one of the regulators.
Well,
Yeah,
Christy,
the questions you bring up, yeah,
let's give the rest of our audience the lowdown on, there aren't, Christy and Vanessa, correct me if I'm wrong, they haven't gotten any permits to speak of. I mean, they're supposed to be going through Department of Water. They're supposed to be going through the Energy and Environment Cabinet. Christy, what are some of the studies that they should have done that they're just not doing?
They should have done a ground protection program. They should have done a standard operating procedure where they should have checked what species was there in the aquatics as far as that goes. They should have done a water quality, a spring location, watersheds, which they have not done for any of the creeks or streams. They're saying that's unnecessary, but we don't know where these karsts or these caves are going or what creeks or streams they go into. Well, obviously anybody can tell that they're flowing into the ones that they're crossing.
Yeah, this pipeline is supposed to go across 7 streams and waterways and then into the Salt River and then into the Ohio River. And documents, the LG&E admits that this is not just karst, but intense karst. Karst means caves. Caves means, you know, underground cavities that have either water or air in them. So you're doing construction on top of the karst, and you're drilling 300-foot holes, 10 of them, into the karst, presumably to scout it out for storage. And yeah, go ahead.
No, I mean, the way it's being described is really worrisome. And yeah, that's where you know, I was led to this thought that it's for storage. This is a big issue up and down the Ohio River. You know, there's so much gas coming out right now. And in the coronavirus, these images have become common, like of you know, tankers holding oil off the coast and everything. I mean, there was such a frenzy to frack the Marcellus, and part of the economics of fracking, it only keeps going if it keeps going. So they've got to drill harder and harder and get more and more gas, and storage has become a really big issue. And also if they want to move forward to the petrochemical step and start to make things out of natural gas or really ethane, some of the other natural gas liquids. So yeah, that makes sense, but how they could do it kind of under the radar is shocking. So I think you all are digging up like something really important. And now that, you know, I've been made aware of it, it's something I really want to look into as well. And I think deserves attention. Because yeah, they need to be asked some of these questions. You know, what are you doing? What do you have these appropriate permits to do it? All these things need to be asked. Yeah,
one thing that's astonishing is just the complete lack of protocol. No permits, no studies, no nothing. The Department of Water is part of the Energy and Environment Cabinet. That neither one of them are doing anything to speak of. Whenever a regulator is called to task, they act like employees of the Louisville Gas and Electric PR department. I mean, they're just so pro Louisville Gas and Electric when they should be doing their jobs as regulators, and they have no apparent desire to do that job.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you all become the regulators.
It's embarrassing.
Right? It is, yeah. I mean, because one thing's, you know, like whatever happened to standing up for your work and doing what you think is right, and how could you stare this thing in the face and think it's right? But yeah, I mean, this is what I see, and unfortunately, or for better or for worse, time and again, is people are the real regulators here. And if no one has the energy, and I know it takes a lot of energy to dig in like you all have, there's no regulation. If you all dig in, and hold them accountable, then like there's regulation, but it's people powered regulation, right? It's not coming from the regulators. And there's a group, I wrote about this in another Rolling Stone article, but a community in Western Pennsylvania that fought an injection well. So these wells I was just describing, they would have trucks come in regularly, beautiful area of woods and farms and creeks, and a lot of people fish and hunt. They care about the land a lot. And they're like, no way, we don't want an injection well. But when they went through the regulatory step, they realized all that was going to happen was maybe they would get a permit for like a little bit less waste. They weren't going to not get the injection well. And so they, joined up with this group called CELDIF, Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, and used all these innovative legal tactics like granting nature legal rights. And they ended up forming a home rule within their community. And they were essentially able to make a charter for their community that said, oil and gas waste is illegal in our community. And even though this is like explosive for the court system, it's still moving through the court system. And like 8 years later, they don't have an injection well. So they've there is this awareness, I think, that the regulatory system isn't going to fix us. They're not going to save us. And rights of nature is a really interesting movement that's come out of that.
Right.
I mean, you could give caves rights and say, you're violating the right of this cave to exist naturally. And they might know what. For years, possibly. Right.
Well, Vanessa has had to deal with these wells that they're drilling, and why are they drilling 12 300-foot holes? They won't say. You would think it might be for extraction and drilling, but that seems maybe unlikely, but we don't know. But then it's either for drilling, it's either for extraction or storage. And Vanessa's saying that when LG&E was asked about the purpose of this well, for other words, we might be scouting out storage somewhere,
right.
Not here. But if you're not scouting it out here, what are you doing here?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So I want to follow up on this and help try and get to an answer. So I already connected with Kimberly, but maybe what's best is that sometime later on next week or something to have a talk with a couple folks who are following this, so I can get really well informed, and then I can take the questions and just at least, even if I can't, I have to go to an editor to get an okay on a story. Realize like, oh wow, people are, outside of our area are paying attention. So I think that's an important next step. It seems pretty possible to me.
Yeah, I'm wondering whether to wrap it up. We probably ought to wrap it up in a few minutes and then resume this conversation later. But if anyone has questions, please, now's the time to spout them out.
I'm going to answer, well, people think I'm going to answer the first question about brine. So I'm looking at the map. So Kentucky does not spread oil-filled brine on roads. At least that's the state law. So it is, they do not use it unless 2016.
That's one thing we got going for us. Kentucky does not believe in spreading radioactive waste on the roads and into the waterways. Who'd have thought?
I got to say, can you tell what's the Halliburton loophole? And then I heard that there's some action to undo the Halliburton loophole. And I'm just thinking about regulatory capture in general.
Yes.
We've got right of nature track as a way to address it. Have you seen any other I recommend to people? I saw a Haymarket book, Naomi Klein and Arundhati Roy, The Pandemic as Portal, talks real good.
Right. Yeah.
Arundhati Roy basically says the people with the best luck at stopping things are people who are personally connected to the land where it's going to happen, who say, no, this can't be here, rather than all the other like different broad-based environmental groups. It's always people in the certain place, like you described, the Western Pennsylvania folks. And legal strategies.
Okay, yeah, no, it's great, and I think I want to check that book out. That sounds excellent, and it sounds spot on. Yeah, so there's the Halliburton loophole is certainly important, and it has to do with like basically jerry-rigging all the rules that to enable anything the industry hadn't already sunk their teeth into to make things easier for them, you know, like closing up some of the final steps. But something really what happened well before the Halliburton loophole, and that has to do with the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. So go back to the first image I described. You know, you don't just have oil and gas at a wellhead coming up, you have all sorts of different wastes. You have brine, which can be radioactive. You have the scale, which accumulates, can be quite radioactive. We have drill, which in the case of the Marcellus, because we're drilling horizontally through the radioactive black shale layer, they can be radioactive. All these different types of oil and gas waste, even though they have toxic heavy metals, radioactivity, they have been defined by US law as non-hazardous. And that's because of this one law known as RCRA, or the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. So in the late 1970s, the US is really trying to clean up its act when it comes to industrial waste. And it had what is the worst industrial waste? What's the most hazardous? And we're going to label that stuff hazardous industrial waste. We're going to, and if we designate it as hazardous, that means it's going to go into appropriately marked trucks. It's going to be driven and dealt with for hazardous waste, and it's going to end up at a disposal site appropriately designed to carry hazardous waste. But the oil and gas industry, all of these wastes I just described with all these problems, it was given this massive exemption. And even though the EPA actually knew and looked at oil and gas waste and was like, oh wow, there's radioactivity, they determined that if you were to classify all the oil and gas waste that should be classified as hazardous, if you were actually to do that, you would cause a, quote, these are their words, severe economic burden on the industry. You essentially wouldn't even have enough regulators to regulate it all, and you wouldn't have enough disposal sites to deal with it all. So early on, that was in 1980 that EPA finally made this determination. It's going to be too much hassle to label this oil and gas waste as hazardous, so we're going to have to call it non-hazardous. And all of the issues I've laid out stem from that. I mean, you could not put brine into a truck that looks like a septic truck with no warning signs and have no training for the driver if you did not have this loophole. And I bring it up because New York has actually come up, or I should say some groups working within New York, Earthworks and many other groups have come up with Sane Energy, which is another really great New York group, grassroots group, have come up with a law to flip that, to overturn the exemption within New York. And even though it's just New York State, you know, once could be pretty major. So that was, I was set to go to Albany, to the New York State Capitol, and speak about this right before the coronavirus hit. And it's obviously put on hold now, but I know the people behind this legislation want to bring it up again. And that's something really important, because if one state could do it, you could start how absurd it is that you're calling hazardous waste not hazardous. And also, by the way, you know, that's why you can put it on roads. That's why you can put it in a landfill meant for household garbage. The cost of the industry would go up significantly, and it would almost, I mean, in a way, it would just make them play fair, right? It's not like you want to end this industry. You just want to say, hey, why don't you play by the rules that the rest of us are? And so I think it's a really effective strategy. You're still working within the system. And so I spend so much time on it because that's important. I would say follow the New York law. When there, you know, try and think of a way to replicate that in Kentucky and in other states, because I think they're really on the brink of, at least in New York, doing it.
Well, one thing that has been pointed out to me, they always talk about bringing jobs to your area, but it's not about jobs to them, it's about profits. Regulation actually is good for jobs. It might be bad for profits, but it's good for jobs because you need a regulator and you need, you know, so anyway.
No, it's such a great point, right? And I mean, right, if you had if you had to wear proper gear, you'd have a company making the gear, you'd have a new company testing the stuff, you would create all sorts of jobs. It's such an important point. And I think that's part of our job also, is to disable those talking points. And even how they pit the worker against the environmentalist, you know, that's ridiculous, as if, one doesn't care about the other.
And this whole RCRA thing, it's like it's a mass. When the EPA says we can't do this, it would be too expensive and burdensome for the industry. Well, that's like saying we're going to allow the industry to shift their cost. They're going to make off with the profits while they're shifting their costs onto us, and mainly the health costs, environmental costs, but the health cost.
Absolutely.
The industry is not going to pay for the cost of the illness it causes.
Absolutely. And if you were, that's why it's great to connect with people to raise awareness on this. And some folks have looked economically, what would happen if suddenly oil and gas waste had to be called hazardous instead of non-hazardous? Costs would go up according to the few estimates that are out there, not just, like twice, 2 times or 3 times. It would be like 100-fold increase in their cost, because suddenly they'd have to ship material that now can go to a county dump where it's cheap to put it. In some cases, they out to Utah to a low-level radioactive waste site. So it would really alter the situation. And yeah, you're right that the EPA made this easy decision, and now our health is at risk in many complicated ways from it. It's troubling and it's sad.
Well, if anybody has any more questions, now's the time. Otherwise, we're going to let Justin have some final thoughts and maybe pick this up another day. I really appreciate you talking to people. Appreciate you talking to Kimberly Brown and other people. I would love to see you talk with Christy and Vanessa and see where those conversations go. And it's validating to hear that, man, this is, I can't, if this goes on the radio, there's certain words I can't say, but let's say it's a crap storm of regulators not doing their job. It's like, do your job. Like, you have a job, do your job. And then Department of Water, do your job. Energy and Environment Cabinet, what's up with the fact that there are not any tests being done? But anyway, that's another conversation.
No, because how do you end this? I mean, we need like punkier people. I just think of like, any sort of music movement. Like, you want the punk rock person in the regulatory job, like who's willing to just be a badass, right? And be like, and what's amazing is that's happened. So in Louisiana, there was one good regulator in the late 1980s who put forth rules on this, and like everything started to be done well. And I talked to that person at length for my story, and the industry had this big moment of awakening where they suddenly thought like, wow, how expensive is it going to be for us to deal with this radioactivity issue? But that's all because of one awesome regulator who just did their job. So it's possible, regulators. This guy's name is Paul Templé, and he did it, and it can be done. And I think, so maybe we need more of us. I mean, we've got to like get to the role of regulators somehow. And like when we have, one of us in there, maybe things will be done better. I don't know. But as far as final thoughts, I'll say, yeah, definitely feel free to reach out to me. I look forward to a conversation with some of you about that particular issue, the pipeline issue. And I have produced, which I think some of you know about, this book I'm calling the Radioactive Cookbook. It's got artwork by 2 different people who live in oil and gas areas. And it also has a detailed list of questions intended for people who are fighting pipelines and compressor stations. And the questions are specific to the radioactivity issue. So the idea is to, backed up by often the industry's own reports or government reports that do exist on these issues, be able to ask these folks like, hey, are you measuring the radon coming out of the flare stack? Are you measuring the radon daughters? And they might have no idea what you're talking about, but you've now put the question on the record and hopefully, open people's eyes. And at some point, these things will start to stick. And if you want, if this is something—
Justin, how can people get in touch with you?
Yeah, so just send me an email. There's going to be a way, if you want to make a donation.
Your email address is justinnoble@gmail.
Yeah, Justin Noble,
Noble, Nobel @gmail.com.
Yeah. And it's totally free. If you want to make a donation for the book, that's fine, but it's just send me an email. I can send you one. That's no problem at all. I'm really excited to do it. And it's also, again, it's something kind of like one of the things, I don't know if it will show through Zoom, but one of the folks, the artists, made radioactive cartoons, oil and gas cartoons, which are, it's just to like take this,
What's the name of the
into
book?
Radioactive Cookbook. So this is like a zine. Think of it as like a zine. I've made a zine on the oil and gas radioactivity topic. Simon & Schuster doesn't know anything about this. It's probably like against my contract to do it, but I'm trying to think of like another way to bring this out. And when I met Kim, who's the name of the artist who had the radioactive cartoons, you know, this sort of merged. And so trying as much as I can, I mean, make it artful, which I'm sure a lot of folks I know
It sounds like a great book. If you're on the call, stay on. We're
Yeah.
going to end the recording, but then we're going to hang out for a few minutes.